Today, I'd like to talk about fiscal federalism, and this is the flow of money between federal and state governments. And there are different types of gifts and programs and grants that the federal government actually shares with the states. So, a grant in aid, or simply a grant, is money given by the national government to the states. It has continued to grow really since the Great Society in the early 1960s. The amount of money the federal government gives to the states now is quite large. Washington pays the bill for a lot of state run programs. So I quickly want to go over what types of grants there are, and then talk about other portions of fiscal federalism like revenue sharing, block grants, and mandates, funded and unfunded. So this is an account, I think, that you can see the breakdown of what topics and projects the federal government helps with for the states. So this is called Medicaid accounts for nearly 2/3 of all federal grants to states. And this is the distribution by program area in the fiscal year 2015. So the program Medicaid is a large chunk of money that the federal government gives to the states. Here's 14% on income security, 8% is spent on transportation, which includes roads and bridges, 7% of grants deal with education, and then there are other health issues and everything else that might fall under that. So I thought this was a good chart just so you can see what types of things the federal government helps the states with. Now, in looking at grants, fiscal federalism, again, is just that flow of money in federal and state relations. So there's different types of grants. One, categorical grants. You're going to see these other types called conditions of aid in order to qualify. And then we'll look at project and formula grants. So the definition of a categorical grant is just it's money given for a specific purpose. So in doing that, often a state might have a matching fund. For example, if the state needs help with a road, the federal government might say, if you raise 50%, we will match it with a contribution from the federal government. So oftentimes we call these strings attached. If you do this, then you can get money. But the government pretty much puts the rules on what category the money gets to be spent on. So states lose a little autonomy and discretion in this type of money. Another one I put here, it often has limitations called conditions of aid, which is strings attached. It can be used to force a state to adopt a policy, and you can look at South Dakota versus Dole. And it also can include non-discriminatory hiring practices and environmental restrictions. So there are different types of categorical grants as well. Some are called projects, some are called formula. So a project grant is when it is a competitive application process. Some of you going to medical school and into biology will want to do research or apply for grants that will fund your research projects. So those are very competitive, and you have to apply to do that and meet certain criteria. Another one is known as a formula grant, and this is a formula that the state or federal government uses to distribute funds, and that could be a great example is the welfare reform in 1996, where President Clinton gave money back to the states to assist the poor, but they use a formula in order to distribute those funds. So another thing I want to touch on just real quickly is a federal state issue known as mandates. Now we've looked at grants and conditional grants, categorical grants, project and formula, but a mandate is a law or regulation that a court decision compels a state or local government to take action under the threat of legal action or loss or reduction of federal funding. Ooh, sorry for the typos there, I didn't catch that. Often these are unfunded. So basically a mandate is the federal government's going to tell the states what you do, and you have to do it whether you like it or not, and sometimes federal government's not going to pay for it. So I put some of these great examples down. The Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990, states were required to make public facilities handicap accessible, but Congress gave no funds for that purpose. So that's called an unfunded mandate. You still have to carry through with it, but the states are going to have to come up with the money. Another example of a mandate is the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It required certain states to change the way they operated their voting, And this process ensured African Americans were given the opportunity to vote, and they tried to make the election process fair. Another one, an example, the desegregation of schools, that was a mandate in the court case Round versus Topeka Board of Education, where they overturned Plessy versus Ferguson and said separate but equal was unconstitutional. So it allowed for the integration of children into schools, and you can't separate by race. Two other examples, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act. And we also do sometimes have state mandates, which are things the states tell all of us, citizens of the states, that we have to do. One example that affects you all is the meningitis vaccination. Before you go to university, you have to have that vaccination before you are admitted or before you attend that university. So these are different examples of mandates. They're directives given by the government to be carried out. This was a little chart I found on the meningitis prevention. These are mandates for colleges and universities, so you can sort of go down through that. For example, Kansas, it said mandate for education or vaccination. That's yes. This is on any campus housing. It applies to all incoming students residing on the campus. Is it an education mandate? No. Proof of vaccination or waiver required. And yes, that means documentation must be turned in. So I just thought you'd like a little more detail on that. Now, as we look at federalism, I wanted to show you this chart to see how many levels of government there are. Federalism allows for more participation in government. We have one federal government, 50 state governments, 89,000 local governments. So in total, how many systems of government do we have in the US? Over 89,000. Think of all the places that people can get involved. Think of all the checks on power, not only in separation of powers and checks and balances at the federal level, but that vertical federalism and the check on power between federal and state. So let's look at advantages. It increases participation, especially in elections, because states control elections. It involves people. It handles complex policy on many levels of government. It builds state and local voice. Look at all the ways that people can get involved, and encourages diversity on a broad range of policies. The disadvantages of federal system, sometimes it leads to fragmentation of U.S. politics, such as we saw in the Civil War, where the states are versus federal or local or versus state. Sometimes we hold so many elections, such as April, August. We have the primaries, we have the general election, we have midterms every 2 years, we have presidential elections every 4 years. Sometimes that says too many elections can lead to apathy. Some believe there's an inequity in the federal system in providing the same programs consistently to all 50 states. Because of the formula program, some states think the wealthier states might get more compared to poorer states, that education funding is unequal, etc. And this last one, strong states can sometimes delay national policy, such as that on desegregation. So there's pros and cons to this whole entire system. But what we have come to know is that there are clear-cut ways to distribute money, to distribute things, and to get people involved in our level of government. So what I've done here, these very last few, we've gone over fiscal federalism. I just want to talk about block grants real quick. Remember, block grants are federal funds or money that can be used by a state in a broadly defined area such as community development, health, or education. States prefer block grants. It gives them more discretion on how money can be spent. And again, the example I gave earlier, the Welfare Reform Act of 1996, really overhauled the welfare system and created a new program that gave more control to the states and took it away from the federal government. This is just another slide talking about categorical grants being for a specific purpose, and I gave you some more examples. Conditional grants had the strings attached. If you do this, we will give you this. And we talked about matching funds. And I just talked there again about the federal highway system. If you lower the federal highway miles per hour speed limit to 55, then we'll give you money for roads and bridges. So states lowered that in the 1970s. Okay, revenue sharing was one thing that states did like. This is sharing of taxes or revenue from the national government to the states. The states loved this because there were really hardly any strings attached at all. There were no matching funds, and it could be spent on any governmental purpose that was needed. Reagan liked this program, but eventually realized uh, when it ended that states were not accountable for the money, so they ended up stopping the revenue sharing program. So, mandates requiring the federal government, I've already talked about that. Remember, we have funded and unfunded. And sometimes, when the Supreme Court can't make decisions or a issue fails in the court, people will take it to Congress, and then Congress will issue mandates. A lot of civil rights issues, such as the Americans with Disabilities Act, have been carried out that way. Again, on mandates, the 10th Amendment, it says no protection versus mandate. So, again, they have to follow it out. Sometimes mandates come from the courts, such as in desegregation in Brown versus Topeka. And again, unfunded mandates are a problem for the states. So, you can go ahead and read the rest of these. These are just other ways for people to get involved in intergovernment lobbying and getting involved at different levels. And devolution, again, a return of power from the national government to the states. And that's a little thing on nullification, and I just gave you a definition. So I hope this has helped a little bit on fiscal federalism.